So welcome guys to another episode of Parvez's Trade. My name is Parvez Khan, and today on episode 6, we'll be talking about the future of USA's leadership in the world, how the election of the recent US election, how this second term of Trump is going to look, what the election of Trump means for the rest of the world, for the global conflicts that we are witnessing. And for people who don't know who I am, I already explained in one video, but I'll just give an idea. I'm an ex-trader. I studied in a place called Calgary in Alberta, Canada. My background was in chemical engineering. And then I got into trading because I love trading. So I worked as an energy trader. I will not mention the company, but I've been trading from a young age and, working as a trader as well. That really kind of incentivized me to follow global politics from a young age because if for any trader out there, they know that the financial markets move based on geopolitical events. And so I've been following global politics for a long time, and I'll be sharing what I think the next few years will look like around the world and how you can make money from it. And yeah, let's get started. So for those of you who don't know, Mr. Trump did win the recent election in November 6th this year, and he's coming to power next year in January on a platform of getting USA out of all these global conflicts. And so I think the big confusion that a lot of people have around the world is, so we had the corona in 2020, we had the COVID, and just as the world was getting out of COVID in 2021, Russia invaded Ukraine. And then you had wars in Africa, wars in the Middle East, and the world's been on fire ever since people returned, got out of their war, got out of their quarantine. So people were expecting a good life, getting back to normal after COVID, but what ended up happening was the entire world started burning, basically. And I guess the people's confusion is why? Why is the world burning all of a sudden after we just got out of this disastrous COVID pandemic? And I think the turning point, the critical point was US's withdrawal. And I think a lot of people will agree with me on this. It's when USA withdrew from Afghanistan in 2021 under Joe Biden, they withdrew in a way that didn't project strength. I mean, you can withdraw from a battlefield, you can withdraw from a war, from a conflict, and still project strength. But the US withdrawal was completely reckless, completely out of the blue, and it didn't project or display US's strength. What it displayed was the decline of US military to fight another war. And yeah, basically USA being on the defense, even though they're having the largest military budget in the world. They have one of the biggest armies, obviously one of the most powerful armies in the history of mankind. But the way they withdrew from Afghanistan just showed that their army is not ready to fight, get into another conflict. And yeah, so I think that was the turning point. That's when the rest of the world realized that a power vacuum is being created of leadership in the world. And power vacuum always gets filled. Okay, whenever there's a power vacuum in the world, it never the power chair never stays empty. Someone always tries to sit down. And yeah, Russia, China, they're trying to grab that leadership position. Russia went first, and people say Russia had no right to invade Ukraine. Ukraine's sovereignty matters and all that. But I'm pretty confident that most Western people, if you ask them, let's say 5 years ago, if to identify Ukraine on a map, they couldn't do it. And so I think the fundamental issue is you have to understand why are all these Western established political parties advocating for uh, Ukraine to fight Russia? And people say, oh, they want to uphold the rule of international law. and they don't want to set an example where people can just invade with force. I mean, those are nice excuses, but the truth of the matter is who benefit. You have to look any conflict around the world, you have to follow the money trail. Okay, you can't go to war without money. Okay, that's been true ever since mankind first started wars. You need financial backing to go to war. And so when this Ukraine war started, for example, you just have to follow the money trail to understand who benefits from this war, who's advocating for this war, and companies that's benefiting from this war is obviously the US military industrial complex. That's obvious. But I think another fundamental issue here is that Russia did have some valid reasons to go to war. I mean, obviously, they want to create a buffer between them, their Western borders, and the European countries so that the US nuclear missiles can't be placed just right next door to Russia. The same way America wouldn't want Russian missiles placed in Cuba or Mexico. That just seems like a valid point. But obviously, the US military complex has been benefiting enormously from this war. And the loser seems to be Ukraine and Joe Biden. I mean, Joe Biden lost this election, I think, for a big part because of the war, because he couldn't end the conflict in 3 years. And people realized that, okay, this conflict is not about sovereignty. It's okay, people are making money from this war. And yeah, so I think now the question then arises, why didn't Putin advocate for this war before COVID? Why did he get into this conflict after COVID? And I think he was just waiting for the right moment, like any smart leader would, right? The Western countries are just getting out of a pandemic that has been polarizing their societies, and the withdrawal of Afghanistan, it was just a perfect opportunity. And if you're a smart leader, you don't miss an opportunity. And yeah, I think that's what happened there. And then you have conflicts in sub-Saharan Africa, all these countries switching from the French imperialist colonizer and switching to Russia's backing. And people say, oh, they're not democratic, they are military juntas and all that. But I mean, the democratically elected leaders that were French backed and American backed before this revolution in sub-Saharan Africa, they were not very democratic either. So I mean, yeah, we can people can see through this smoke screen. And then you have the war in the Middle East, which has been the latest conflict. And yeah, people talk about how I don't want to get into details. Obviously, it's a war that didn't start on October 7th, that's for sure. The conflict has been going on for a long time. And but again, you have to follow the money trail, who benefits, who makes money. And I read a recent report that I think Wall Street traders made around $500 million by trading Israeli government bonds and trading Israeli currency. And you have to understand, whenever there's a volatility in the system, traders make money. Okay, you don't make money when the world is peaceful and everything's running smooth. You make money when there's volatility as a trader. And so, yeah, I just try to follow the money trail. And the Ukraine war made the US military industrial complex made a lot of money. The war in sub-Saharan Africa, I mean, the French nuclear companies were making a lot of money from there. And since Russia came in, they lost a lot of their contracts to enrich, to extract uranium from those countries. And in the Middle Eastern war, obviously, the Wall Street traders, bond traders of Israeli government bonds have been making decent money. So I try to follow the money trail, and it just shows. Uh, I wouldn't say they're responsible, but they'll have incentive to prolong the war, clearly. And now the big question comes then, Trump is back in power. What does he do? Can he actually resolve all these conflicts? Okay. And well, again, Trump is a businessman. he'll want to make a deal that's beneficial to USA. And to get Russia out of that conflict with Ukraine basically helps him to make Russia less dependent on China. Right, get rid of the sanctions, bring Russia back to the Western Hemisphere. But I think Russia is smart enough to see that Trump is in for 4 years. The Democrats will clearly come to power one day in the future. And so he has a reliable long-term partner and relationship with China and Xi Jinping. And on the other hand, you have USA, whose leadership is clearly declining around the world, and the leaders are getting switched back and forth every 4 years. I mean, it's an obvious bet which one you have to bet on. That doesn't mean that Putin will not try to stop the war. He'll definitely be incentivized to get some land in eastern Ukraine and stop the war, or at least get a temporary ceasefire. But the question then comes, what does Trump gets out of it, right? Because Trump is a smart man. He realizes Russia is with China for the long haul. So if Trump tries to negotiate a deal between Russia and Ukraine, what does Trump get out of it? And if he doesn't see much to be received, I mean, right, like if Trump realizes that Putin is sticking with China and the BRICS in the long haul, and then what's his benefit? What's America's benefit to negotiate a ceasefire with between Russia and Ukraine? And people might say, "Oh, people will stop dying." So, but let's be honest here. Trump is a businessman. He wants to make something beneficial for America in the process that he can advertise to the Americans. And I think what will end up happening is Trump might succeed in getting a temporary ceasefire with Ukraine, but you'll basically, to put it simply, buy Putin time to get into a bigger war in the future. Because I don't think Putin will stop in Ukraine. I don't blame him. I think he will look, Vladimir Putin has said it that in his mind, the greatest collapse, the greatest misery of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the 20th century included the First and Second World Wars. But he thought the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest uh, catastrophe of the 20th century. And he clearly wants those buffer states between Western Europe and his country. So getting those Eastern European countries into his fold will clearly be on his mind. Now the question is, does he have the manpower and the military arsenal to do that right now? To fight that conventional war. It's not going to be a nuclear war. Russia has enough conventional missiles to uh, fight a war, but the thing is, do they have the capacity to sustain the war? If they do get into Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, and I think that's will be the next play. Yes, Trump will try to negotiate a deal between Vladimir and Ukraine. You know, get a temporary ceasefire going, but then maybe he'll push on NATO to do more heavy lifting. So America will have to spend less money on military in the Europe, and he might uh, pitch that as a sale, as a win to American people. Hey, I got a ceasefire between Vladimir and Zelensky, between Putin and Zelensky. So European countries, now you do the heavy lifting to enrich your security, and you know that way US military will spend less money securing Western Europe. And yeah, Trump might, hang that over the European countries, be like, hey, if you don't want to increase the defense spending, I'm not going to negotiate a ceasefire between Vladimir Putin and Zelensky. That's one way to go because I really don't see what's in it for Trump to negotiate a ceasefire between Zelensky and Putin. Because I mean, Russia has made the decision to shift their interests, their policies, their long-term relationships with the East, with China, India, and global South. And I don't think Trump can sway Putin out of that mindset. And like Vladimir says that, but Putin has said that recently after the election of Trump that a new world order is being created, and the election of the American president will not change that. And I think he's right. I think in that sense he's right. So like the big question the, is what does Trump gain from negotiating a ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia? And from what I see, not much really. I don't see much that he'll gain from negotiating a ceasefire. And what will he gain from lifting those sanctions on Russia? It'll help Russia, but will that sway Russia to shift their interest back to the West? I don't think so. So what does it gain? So there's that. Like the recent conflict has intensified in Ukraine because if there is a ceasefire in a few months, you want to be in as much of a dominant position on the battlefield so you can have greater negotiating power when you're on the negotiating tables. That's pretty obvious. But the fundamental question remains, what does Trump gain, right? If Trump doesn't see he gains anything from negotiating a ceasefire, he'll just, hey, do what you want. European countries, you do your defense spending. It's not our problem. But at the same time, Trump has said this very openly that he wants USA to be a global exporter. He wants to bring the manufacturing base to USA and make USA a global exporter of goods rather than an importer. And I think from that angle, if you look at it, Trump would want to export more products to Europe, to Russia maybe. And it would be nice to have a good relation with Russia to help them get a ceasefire, and then maybe they'll allow more American goods to be sold in the market. Maybe. But will Western Europe allow more American goods to be dumped in the market? It's hard to say. Western Europe is also thinking about, you know, creating the European Union is thinking about creating their own military. So they might decide not to. They might decide to just do their own ceasefire deal between Ukraine and Russia. But yeah, I know Trump said it you know, during the election that he will solve the war between Russia and Ukraine in 24 hours. I know he said that, but uh, maybe he can. But what does he benefit from it? I don't know. I really don't know. I don't see much that he benefits. Maybe he's displaying U.S. leadership around the world, but that's been on the decline for many years. So there might be a temp. I mean, like for example, today I think yeah, Biden negotiated a ceasefire deal between Hezbollah and Israel. It's a 60-day ceasefire deal, which is interesting. So the ceasefire deal between Israel and Lebanon will be until Trump came to power. And so in that sense, if you think about it, Trump comes to power, the ceasefire deal is off. Israel can go back into Lebanon and fight the Hezbollah, and then it's up to Trump if they want, if he wants to incentivize Israel to get a ceasefire. Trump did say that he pushed Netanyahu to accelerate the process, to not cause any more misery, to finish the job as soon as possible. So it's mixed message for sure, but for me, I don't see much that like if USA wants to be a global exporter, where is your consumer base, right? Asia has been projected to be the global world center of demand for commodity products, for goods in the next 50 to 100 years because of the growing population, growing middle class, and growing wealth. So if Trump wants to make America a net exporter, he has to find ways to sell American goods to Asia because that's where the consumer demand is. It's not in Europe. And clearly, there's not a big consumer demand. I mean, yes, he can sell in Saudi and all the Middle Eastern countries, but it's not going to be as big as Asia. The big market to export American goods would still be Asia. So whatever deal he makes between Israel and the Palestinians and the Hezbollahs, and between Vladimir Putin and Zelensky, he will want to find ways he can garner respect of the global south of the Asia. And obviously, when you talk about Asia, you're talking about China, you're talking about India, you're talking about other countries, right? Indonesia, and it's a mixed bag, right? They all have different opinions on this war. I mean, not all of them. Like on the Russia-Ukraine war, most of the Asian countries support Russia. On the war between Israel and Palestine, I mean, there's many countries in Asia that supports Palestine. India is kind of a neutral on that. But again, so that's where the hurdle comes in. Trump doesn't want to take a hard-on stand with Israel and Zelensky. Otherwise, you lose that consumer base in Asia. So it's a tricky situation. And yeah, I just don't see what Trump benefits from being aggressive in negotiating a ceasefire. Obviously, he wants to keep his word. His election promise was to negotiate a ceasefire. So I guess that's the only benefit he gets. But in terms of economic benefit for USA, I don't see much. And I see more, yeah, I just don't see much that USA benefits economically by stopping these wars. So, uh, and then let's come to China, the China-Taiwan conflict, right? So, like, Trump is an isolationist. He doesn't want to get America involved in all these global wars. He just wants to be a net exporter of goods. He wants to make America a net exporter of goods. And he wants to make sure to use America's military to secure the transfer of these goods to the consumer bases around the world. And that's about it. He's not there to push America's ideology around the world. And yeah, so if China decides to invade Taiwan, will Trump come to Taiwan's rescue? I highly doubt it because then, well, it doesn't make him look any different than Joe Biden. So if Xi Jinping has to choose a time to invade Taiwan, will he invade it under a global perspective, a Democrat in power, or an isolationist Republican like Trump in power? And I think obviously it makes more sense to do that war when an isolationist is in power like Trump. So the chance of China invading Taiwan in the next few years is very high. The exact moment is hard to tell. But now the question for Xi Jinping is, does he want to do it towards the end of Trump's term, or does he want to do it get it done in the first 2 years? Because towards the end of Trump's presidency, he will have to choose a successor if he unless he wants to continue being a president. And I think when I think about Trump's second term, I'm reminded of America's Republican president at the end of 1920s. So there were towards the last few years of the 1920, America had a Republican president. I think his name was Herbert Hoover or something, and he was pretty much the same as what Trump is right now, isolationist, tariff on all imports. But instead of energizing the American industrial base, manufacturing base, it ended up causing the Great Depression because turns out when you tariff all your imports, other countries are not just going to sit idle, they'll tariff your imports, your exports to their countries. And so that's where the issue comes in, right? And yeah, Herbert Hoover's isolationist tariffing policy really led to the Great Depression of the 1930s and led to the election of FDR. So I look at Trump as something like that, Trump's second term. And maybe there won't be many wars in his term because he's a good negotiator and he's not globalist. He doesn't want to use America's military industrial complex to project power. And so these countries like Israel, Ukraine, you name it, if they don't have the backing of America's military industrial complex, they're not going to want to fight a prolonged war. That's just common sense. And so, in that sense, ceasefire deals will be made in Trump's term. But I think the isolationist, fighting everyone, tariffing everyone, every country, I don't think anything good will come out of it because you tariff other countries and they'll just sit on the stand line. They'll sit on the stand and just do nothing. That's unrealistic. There will be reaction and they will, you know, tariff your goods as well. And then we come into, so Trump wants to bring the manufacturing base back to USA. So by tariffing the imports into USA, he's making them more expensive, giving American manufacturing companies a competitive edge to make goods in America. But does that make American companies more competitive on a global scale? Right. Let's say you bring in a can of fruits. You import a can of fruits at, let's say, $10 into USA. Let's say you put a 50% tariff on it, so it's now $15. And so let's say there's a manufacturing company in USA that can make that can of fruits inside America for $12. They'll, outcompete their importing competitors and they'll get the American market base. That's important. Okay. But that $12 uh, can of fruit, can the American companies then sell to the rest of the world? I would say no, because the imported $10 can of fruits will still be more competitive than the $12 American can of fruits on a global scale. And so tariffs won't make American companies competitive on a global scale. They'll make them competitive at home, in USA, but the American consumer base is not uh, as is not going to represent the entire world's consumer base. And like this is where the fundamental flaw comes in because, and it was the same during the 1920s. The wealth gap between the poor and the rich was the highest during the 1920s. And like I explained this in the previous video, I explained it with Canada. When your wealth gap increases, the economy is incentivized to produce goods that the rich want, not the poor, not the middle class, because there's no middle class, right? The wealth gap increases, the economy is incentivized to produce goods, luxury goods mainly for the rich, because the middle class is not there anymore. They don't have the purchasing power. The poor is obviously they can't spend too much, non-discretionary spending. So, and America's inequality wealth gap is also now reaching a record level, like an historic high. And so it's reaching close to the 1920s level again. And in this scenario, okay, Trump brings that manufacturing base back to America. But those manufacturing companies might have a competitive edge in America because of the tariffs. But first, they'll not have a competitive edge around the world because those imported goods still are cheap in other countries, and other countries are not tariffing each other. And second, the American consumer base is shrinking because of the wealth gap, the rising wealth gap. And so the manufacturing companies in America will not be able to grow inside America because the middle class is getting wrecked in America. So this is where the problem comes in with Trump's strategy. And it's a good election pitch, don't get me wrong, because most people don't understand this philosophy, complex concepts of how the difference between a economy with a strong middle class, strong purchasing power of the middle class, and an economy where the wealth gap increases, middle class is almost wrecked, growing inequality, growing a rising wealth gap. That economy looks different than an economy with a strong middle class, strong purchasing power. Okay, if you're a manufacturing company in America, if you have the middle class that's strong, enough disposable income, good balance sheet, good finances, then yeah, if you're just even being a manufacturing company in America, you can grow your company in America because you have this strong middle class to sell to. But if the middle class is getting wrecked because you're printing money and the deficit spending is rising and the rising wealth gap that's happening in USA, and then you don't have the strong purchasing power of the middle class. And so as a manufacturing company, you'll be incentivized to produce luxury goods and expensive goods for the rich. And yeah, so rich like very different things than what the middle class and the poor people like. And that market will not be able to, I mean, that market is not going to be tariffed. When Trump is talking about tariffing He's talking about tariffing, putting tariffs on like basic goods like lumber, oil, gas, steel. He's not talking about tariffing luxury goods. And so this is where the fundamental issue comes in. And this is, I think, what most Americans don't get, that you can't just be an isolationist, be on the defense, cut yourself off from the rest of the world, and put all these tariffs in to make your domestic manufacturing more competitive and expect to create an export base. That doesn't work. Okay. It has been tried in America under Herbert Hoover in the 1920s. It didn't work, and I just don't think it's going to work right now. And sorry. And yeah, I uh, people are very optimistic about Trump coming back to power. And I just urge people to look back at what Trump did in his first term. Look, I'm not a big fan of Joe Biden. Okay, I think he's a warmonger. But to say Trump is going to be the great savior of Americans, it's a far-fetched idea because reality is America's middle class is getting wrecked because the dollar is getting printed at an aggressive pace because of all the deficit spending. And once other countries stop using US dollar as a global reserve currency, you cannot export your inflation. And that's important, okay? The reason US inflation has been so low, even after printing so much money in the last few years, is because they were able to export their inflation to other countries because other countries were buying dollars to keep as a reserve currency. But other countries are now moving towards gold, towards the BRIC system, towards crypto. That means what? That means that printing of money cannot, the inflation caused by printing of massive sums of money and not having serious hyperinflation because you have the privilege of a reserve currency, that status is gone. So any deficit spending and new money in circulation will, you cannot export that inflation. Okay, it will be inside America's economy. And like my prediction is once Trump brings in these tariffs, most countries will not back down. They'll try to negotiate a deal, but if they can't, they'll not back down. They'll move on. They'll go trade with China. There's an entire world outside America to trade with. And so they'll not back down. And what will end up happening for most countries, not all, but most countries will basically reduce their trade with America. They'll be like, hey, America's middle class is already shrinking. You have a growing middle class in Asia, great purchasing power. We can sell our goods to Asia. Why are we bothering trading with America in the first place? And yeah, so once other major countries stop doing significant amount of trade with USA, they'll be like, hey, why were we holding all these US dollars in our reserve? We don't even trade with USA. And they're printing money like crazy. It makes no sense. Why are we buying all these US bonds? And that's when that US dollar inflation will reach the hyperinflation stage. And that's what I mean by not being able to export your inflation to other countries. And people say, okay, America will just get a balanced budget, deficit spending cut. Elon Musk comes in, Doge, Department of Government Efficiency. And again, that's a fancy idea. I just don't see it working because Elon Musk talks about cutting government staff, cutting reducing waste in government staff. But if you look at America's budget, their main costs are their military, the interest payment on their debt, and their welfare spending. You cannot get rid of America's military spending anytime soon. Okay, it's Pentagon will not allow it. It will be a national security issue, and all that, and they'll have to gear up for any potential future war with China and the East and all that. So the military spending, Elon Musk will have no control over. Okay, cool. And then you have what is this? You have the interest payments. That's rising. Okay, interest payments are not coming down. Okay, the interest rates are gonna stay high for a long time going forward, and interest payments are not coming down anytime soon. What's the other one? Welfare spending. Well, you have obligations. You can't just get rid. And Elon Musk has no control over welfare spending. The government staff cost is actually one of, not even in, I think, top five of American budget main expenditures. And I think people really need to. I mean, Elon Musk talks a big game. He's smart, but just firing government employees, I don't think it will benefit. I don't think you can get to a balanced budget just by doing that. I mean, look, Ronald Reagan brought the same pitch, right? Hey, we'll get a balanced budget. He just increased the debt and he never got to a balanced budget. Trump talked about bringing a balanced budget in his first term, never did. It's not that easy, especially as this debt is piling up, the interest rates are high, interest payments are not being a big deal. Last year, America's interest payments were higher than America's payment for the military, which is crazy. Okay? The interest you're paying on your loan is higher than the money you're spending for your security. Okay, uh, if you're someone working in the American military, you're thinking like, you know, it's, so you're telling me the bond traders are making more money sitting in a fancy office in Wall Street while I'm risking my life going to war, and yeah, it does seem kind of hypocritical. And then the welfare spending, the pensions that are coming due, baby boomer generation retiring in America in the next 10 years. We talked about how Wall Street stole that money and there's no money there. And so the pension obligations are coming due, and all any other welfare spending has to be approved by Congress. And as much as Congress talks a big game about not giving free money away, you have to understand that a significant chunk of Republican voting base is still made up of old retirees living in Florida. And they're not going to advocate for losing their pension money or anything like that, right? I mean, yeah, sure, if you're an unemployed guy who's in his 30 and his 20, maybe you'll receive less money. But I just don't see any drastic change to America's budget coming anytime soon. And yeah, Trump, appointed a lot of skilled people. Um, but again, we come down to the structural flaw, right? You're renovating the house. The house is full of molds and dust and everything. Okay, you're renovating the house. You got a great team of renovators, but the underlying structure is broken, and you have to basically uh, burn the entire house down and build a new structure from the ground up, which you'll not be able to do in 4 years. And yeah, it just I just don't see how the structural problems can be solved anytime soon. And China recently unveiled a new fighter jet that looks very similar to F-35. And that's a big deal. People say, oh, whatever, another fighter jet. But F-35 is one of America's military's biggest, in their opinion, one of their biggest achievements. That and the B Raider, B-2 Raider, the stealth bomber. So it's just China is now closing the gap between their military technology and America's. And people say China has more number of Navy ships than America does, and then Americans will tell you that it's not a matter of quantity, it's a matter of quality. And to that, I said that I think, look, Stalin wasn't a great guy, but he was a strategist, he was a smart guy. You'll have to give him that. And I think Stalin said it very well that quantity has a quality on its own. And that's absolutely true. Okay. During the Second World War, Hitler, Germany had the fanciest weapons, fanciest military equipment, but they couldn't produce them in mass production because they were so complex. And does that sound very similar? And in the Second World War, America was producing these cheap, more simple designs, but not as sophisticated like the German ones, but they were able to produce these cheap designs at a one more on a mass scale production level. And now, the tables have turned. Basically, now America is complaining or bragging about them having quality weapons rather than quantity of ships. But to be honest, look, if you're in a war and that missile goes through, I mean, Yeah, if you don't have the manufacturing capacity to mass produce your chips, your military base, then yeah, you're not going to win that war, regardless of how the quality of your weapons. I mean, all those countries have nuclear weapons, and you can't threaten a country with nuclear weapons anymore. So, yeah, I think one of the reasons Trump wants to bring back the manufacturing base, like steel, to the USA is because he wants to prepare America for the inevitable war that's coming. And I understand that, you know. Look, a big war is coming. If people are scared with the current wars, um, a big war is coming. Okay, if you've read anything about history, when an declining empire it comes into conflict with the empire on the rise, which is China, that's when wars happen. Okay, so a war is coming. Trump wants to prepare America for the war, and you can't prepare America for a war if you don't have the manufacturing capacity. So I understand where he's coming from, and yeah, but can you really turn the tides? I don't know. Americans are not just going to. I mean, yeah, you can automate a lot of the process, but regardless of how many robots you use and how many AI softwares you use, okay, you're still gonna need boots on the ground. You're gonna need humans to fight a war, to monitor these manufacturing capacity centers and all that. And the truth of the matter is, China has a much larger manufacturing capacity than America does. So if, let's say, Trump now all of a sudden builds up his manufacturing capacity, China will obviously look at it and be like, hey, now is the time to go to war. We don't want America to catch up with our manufacturing capacity. And so, yeah, that's, I think, when if America's manufacturing capacity picks up on the Trump, which it might, that's when China will invade Taiwan. That's my prediction because China will not want to go to war when America's manufacturing capacity is again at a high level, because then they can basically produce any weapons they lost, any equipment they lost. And yeah, that's just my prediction. And I think Putin is not going away anytime soon. He's going to invade the Eastern European countries. And whether you like it or not, he will get his buffer between his country and the Western countries of Europe. And the Western European countries have to decide between spending more money on welfare, spending more money for the pensioners, spending more money on military, and obviously there are debt obligations, interest payment obligations. It's a mess, and I just don't see anything positive happening for the West anytime soon. And yeah, I think now people ask that where will the war start? So the Second World War started in Poland. So will the Third World War also start in Poland? And uh, I think the thing is, people need to understand that Poland. So in my opinion, the Third World War already started. Okay, the moment Russia went into Ukraine without the consent of the West, the Third World War started. That's my personal opinion. There will be a temporary ceasefire, but I think the big war will happen in Asia. Okay, you have America's vassal states, South Korea and Japan, and to some extent Taiwan and Philippines, and they will go against China, Russia in the region, and the other Asian countries will basically be onlookers. And people talked about India and Pakistan getting in that war, joining and getting into fight with each other. And I I personally don't think India and Pakistan will fight each other anytime soon because no matter what Prime Minister Modi says or does, he understands that his future is tied to the global south, to the global east. He can try to get some funding from the Western countries, get their technologies to give him an edge, but he understands that the future belongs to the global south and the global east. Um, he will try not to get into anyone's bad books. That isn't to say he will try to negotiate a deal with Pakistan, but yeah, I mean, in Modi's eyes, India should have never been separated from Pakistan and Bangladesh because Pakistan and Bangladesh never existed as countries before the British came to India. So it was the Bharat, the Great India, before British came. And so in Modi's eyes, Pakistan and Bangladesh should have never been independent countries to begin with. And that's where China comes in, right? Because China will not allow India to run through Pakistan and Bangladesh and yeah, get a dominance in the region. And will China fight India? It's hard to say really, but you have 1.4 billion people in China and then 1.4 billion people in India, and they're competing for global supremacy. And they're basically neighbors. And yeah, India supports Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea. China supports North Korea, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. So you're already seeing all these axes being formed in Asia. And as much as I want to believe the war will not be in Asia, I think the Third World War will actually focus in Asia. So during the Second World War, there was fighting in Asia, but no one cared because Asia was basically bankrupt after the British left. And but now that Asia is getting wealthy again, and it's a big market to sell products for Europe and America, they'll care if there's a war in Asia. They'll take sides. And so, rising China, rising India, uh, will they want to get into conflict and risk losing millions of people in the process? Because Asians have a different mentality towards war than Europeans and Americans do. So, yeah, Asians are very sophisticated and they're more peace oriented because they're dealing with more people and they're more rational, I would say, and they don't think in a zero-sum game like a lot of European countries do that if I win, you lose, or you lose, I win, or if I lose, you win. I don't think Asians think of in a zero-sum game like a lot of European countries do. So I'm not really worried about a ceasefire in Ukraine and Russia because Europeans they don't have that capacity to go fight another war between themselves. Trump is definitely not going to help if there is a war in Europe, a bigger war. And I think the focus will be on Asia. Trump's term, Trump will focus on making sure that China cannot just run through South Korea, Japan, Taiwan. I think Taiwan is much more important to China than what most Europeans and Americans understand. Okay. I think because at people don't. I think a lot of people don't get this. After the Second World War, Taiwan was basically recognized China by UN. So the mainland China was not even the recognized representative of China. It was the Chiang Kai-shek's government in Taiwan that was recognized by the Western countries in the United Nations. So that's a big scar that's still in the mind of the Communist Party of China. And so I think people don't understand how sensitive the Chinese Communist Party is regarding Taiwan. Also, Japan, I mean, Japan didn't help, right? Japan killed so many Chinese people. And Japan didn't help. And South Korea, North Korea, that's a different story. I mean, obviously, Kim Jong-un is not going down, and he will want to hold on to power. By the same time, he doesn't want to risk a war and lose his own power at home. So it really comes down to a calculation of upsides and downsides by going to war. I think China will fight Taiwan in that's inevitable. I think that will happen in the next few years. It might happen under Trump. The question is whether it'll happen in the first 2 years of his term or the last 2 years. I believe it will happen in the first 2 years so that Americans will understand that Trump is not the great negotiator he is. They'll go to the poll in the midterm election of 2027, sorry, 2026, I believe. So 2024, the next midterm election of USA will happen in, I think, 2026. And so before the election, I think China will want to go to war with Taiwan because Trump will be in a tricky bind. If he goes to war, he's losing a significant voting base who basically wants him to be an isolationist. And if he doesn't go to war, then a lot of people will say, hey, Trump really couldn't bring American peace, global peace around the world, There's a new war under him. How is he any different to Biden? And then in the midterm elections, Democrats might seize on that opportunity of China's war with Taiwan, and they might they might get to win the House or the Senate, and then you have, conflicts. Democratic House doesn't work with the Republican Senate or doesn't. That's basically what China's strategy will be. So they want to go to war in the next 2 years before the midterm election in USA. So Trump can't do much because its hand will be tied. He'll just have to sit back and watch. And as a result, Republicans will lose seats. They might lose the majority in House and the Senate, or at least one of them. And then when Trump loses the trifecta, he will not be able to push his agenda through effectively in the last 2 years of his term. And as a result, yeah, the Republican Party will basically in 2028, they'll be in the same situation they were in 2020 with the Democratic House, because without the trifecta, Trump will not be able to push his agenda through in the last few years. I think that will be the plan for Xi Jinping. And yeah, I just don't see a way out of it. I don't see how Xi Jinping will wait for another 4 years, bring a democratic globalist in power, and then go to Taiwan. That just doesn't seem strategic in any way. It's now or never for Xi Jinping, I think. And so I'm more focused on the China-Taiwan war and how that will impact Japan, South Korea, whether North Korea will join China and attack South Korea. He might. Look, you're not gonna test all these missiles just to threaten the USA. You clearly want to get the South Korea back into your own fold. And yeah, so I'm more worried about the war in Asia than I'm worried about the war in Europe, because Europeans it's an aging population. I'm not trying to insult them, but they're aging, they have so much debt. They really don't have the capacity to fight another war. Russia doesn't even have troops to send to Ukraine anymore. That just tells you the state of Europe right now. And yeah, I think the next big deal will be China Taiwan, and look forward to how Trump handles it. And in terms of if you're a trader and you're trying to make money, obviously you want to look in the gold market. Being long in gold is a pretty obvious move because central banks are buying up gold. They don't want to be sanctioned by USA and all that. So when China invades Taiwan, it will come down to how Trump reacts. Does he continue his isolationist policy? And Trump doesn't like Philippines' current president Marcos as well, because he knows Marcos is a warmonger and corrupt guy. So that's what I'm looking forward to. But I don't have this rosy, idealistic picture of everything's going to be well under Trump, because the reality of the world is rising empires don't want to listen to declining empires. And that's just the reality of history, the reality of the current world. And so it doesn't matter how Trump behaves, doesn't behave. The structural flaws in America are not going away anytime soon. The war in Taiwan will clearly, how will it impact the markets, the financial markets? That's a good question. I don't think Trump will sanction China. I don't think he has this sanction mentality, but he'll clearly threaten China by tariffing their goods more. I think that's what he'll basically use that opportunity to tariff China's goods even more, right? I think that's what he'll do. But by that point, I don't think China will care whether they trade with US or not. And yeah, I just don't see how Trump will handle that war in a positive way. And if Taiwan falls, then Japan is in trouble, South Korea is in trouble.